Media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network, here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Botson Street, in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. The Naked City, the city of 1,000 or more stories. This week there seems to be tens of thousands. But enough of that. CoalitionRadio.us, Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. And again, our All Billionaire Baseball Boys Club Twitter feed at Pawtucket is Home, where we will analyze and re-enable our coverage, giving what appears yet another attempt at a post-Easter resurrection of the wet Fenway dream of the billionaires of Pawtucket, using your taxpayer dollars to subsidize their personal playground. Well, let's get right down to it. We've got a busy night tonight. We're about to introduce into our, through the miracle of Skype, someone who has become a regular contributor to the coalition. We like to call them repeat offenders. In the 7 o'clock hour, we're going to have two Thayer Street merchants in who are going to talk about their wares and what they offer to what I call Providence's living and breathing buffet, Thayer Street. And then at 8 o'clock, we're going to have one of the more intriguing entries into the Rhode Island gubernatorial race. He's an independent candidate for governor. He's a doctor. He's an entrepreneur. We'll introduce him, his beliefs, his philosophy, in the 8 o'clock hour. It's a full evening of programming. So joining us live via the miracle of Skype is none other than Byron Schlock, he of the 1889 Institute. Now, we've had him on several times in the past. Byron brings a what I'll call an econometric perspective on affairs of the day. And he's one of our favorite mythbusters. Because rather than just assume the media dialogue is correct, rather than just go along with the talking points, Byron brings a hard economic analysis and perspective to exactly what's going on in terms of economic development, wage issues, union issues, cost of living, the size of government. A decided libertarian streak. He came to us via his involvement with the Goldwater Institute, and now we have him on again as often as possible as a representative of the 1889 Institute. Byron, welcome back to the coalition.
Thanks, it's good to be with you.
Well, now if it's tough because folks in New England, we engage in quite a bit of navel gazing. Some might call it self-absorption. If it isn't important in New England, it can't possibly be important anywhere else, right? Well, across I'll call it what some might have called the Rust Belt or the Great Plains, across the core of America, there is a burgeoning teachers crisis here, and it was started right in your home territory, your turf, your playground in Oklahoma. Maybe you can tell folks what's going on with the teacher community and one of the more challenging teacher strikes in the nation.
Right, well, as you probably know, the Great Recession, state governments have found it difficult to fund just about everything, and Oklahoma is no exception. The only thing is that Oklahoma's recession seemed to extend longer than most because of oil prices. We're a heavily oil-dependent state. When I was living in Texas, I didn't realize how oil-dependent Oklahoma is, but it's very oil-dependent. And so with lower oil prices, our recession continued much longer. The result has been quite a few cuts in state spending. And of course, when you say cuts, it's a relative thing. A lot of the cuts aren't really cuts, they're just not as big of increases as people expected, right?
Right.
And that's been true of public education. There's not actually less money in public education right now in Oklahoma than there has been in the past. It's just that, or at least that's mostly true, the biggest issue has been that it just hasn't increased like people expected to. And on a per student basis, it has actually, spending has actually fallen. Teacher wages haven't fallen that much. They've only fallen because of inflation. And in fact, I calculated just recently that if you look at inflation-adjusted per student spending, while that measure dropped by about 12%, teacher salaries on average dropped about 7%. So they have a little bit of a gripe, a legitimate gripe. They haven't gotten pay increases in a long time. Some teachers in school districts that pay above the state's minimum required salary level haven't increased salaries for teachers because they're not legally obligated to do so, and so teachers legitimately have felt some squeeze. Um, well, this year, I'm not quite sure why this year became such a big deal. I think part of it was because there had been an initiative started by former governor and university president David Byron to to uh, to pass a tax, and it didn't succeed. In fact, it got voted down, and part of the reason was probably because not all the money went to public education, but that got voted down. Then a group of corporate, I guess, bosses, you'd say, the top end of our society here in Oklahoma, proposed tax increases with a few reforms, but very tepid reforms. And they got shut down at the legislature. And I guess after those attempts being shot down, the teachers decided, now's the time. We're just tired of this. And so they decided to go out and strike, even though Oklahoma is a right to work state and strikes are prohibited technically.
Right.
There's some wiggle room in the statute. And what's amazing, I will tell you this: the bottom line is that the legislature had voted in tax increases before the strike ever started, amounting to something like $560 million in new revenue for the state, with a teacher pay raise that was also voted on. And yet the teachers still went out on strike. And when they finally called the strike ended, they had no more at the end of the strike than they did before the strike ever started. It's as if they were just trying to make a big point, and as obnoxiously as they possibly could.
Well, now let me jump in with an observation. The type of wage stagnation that you're talking about with respect to teacher salaries is not exactly uncommon across the nation, is it?
No, not at all. In fact, that's extremely common. And in fact, if you look at incomes during the Great Recession, teacher incomes weren't falling because they're government employees, they're tax supported. Meanwhile, salaries among regular people who are working in the private sector, in fact, did fall and stagnated for a good length of time. Again, it's not as if Oklahoma's economy has been going gangbusters, and it's not as if the legislature is sitting on a big pile of cash,
right,
and just was being, selfish or something and not distributing it. The fact is that the state had revenue problems because people aren't buying a lot of stuff, and because the economy has slowed down and they don't have a lot of confidence in the economy here. So things are coming back. We don't have a high unemployment, but and you could make some argument. I think there's some argument that there were a couple of income tax rate reductions, but the income tax, we border on Texas, has no income tax, and so there's a little bit of a true economic investment in reducing the income tax rate, but that doesn't explain where $500 million in revenue might have gone either.
So, and there's a tendency, if you're an outsider like me, to say to the teachers union, well, welcome to planet Earth. In my line of work, in my day job, it's a very straightforward path to a salary increase. I simply have to go out and sell more.
I completely agree. And, I will say this. My wife is a teacher. She's a public school teacher. She did not want to go out on strike. She did not participate in any way in this thing, except that she was forced not to work because nobody was at the school. But I will say this. From 1960 to the year 2000, per student spending in Oklahoma, adjusted for inflation, tripled. Per student spending tripled in real terms. That's a huge increase. So while you're seeing that increase of 300%, you saw a teacher pay increase of 33%, 1/3. So I look at it as, and now today in Oklahoma, teachers are outnumbered by non-teachers working in the public education system. It's obvious that the system is just a political system. It's created to create political power for school board members and for the teachers unions. And I personally most teachers are pretty hardworking and conscientious. When you look at the incentives in the system, you have to agree they're working uphill compared to the incentives in the system. The fact that they accomplish as much as they do is a testament to many of them having great amounts of goodwill and patience. What's pitiful, though, is that they don't recognize that the people who claim they're speaking for teachers aren't really speaking for teachers. That's the blind that's over teachers' eyes right now, and has been for a long time.
So you have this, as you do here in Rhode Island, you have this explosion in the bureaucracy, the consultants, the middle level management, the so-called experts, while at the same time, overall, you have probably in terms of, if it's like Rhode Island, in terms of population, you have an actual contraction in the an increase in the ratio of students to faculty, which leads me to believe I empathize with your situation. The way I like to sum it up here is that in Rhode Island, public school students are just sort of a necessary annoyance in order to facilitate the continued operation of a large-scale politically charged bureaucracy. And occasionally we have to give something slightly more than lip service to the student's education. But in the meantime, the sun rises and sets on the bureaucracy and their ability to be self-sustaining.
Exactly. That is a nationwide phenomenon. It's why the United States is always one of the top spending countries in the world, always the top 5 of countries in per student spending, even when you adjust for purchasing power. And yet we can't get into consistently the top 20 in any international comparison when it comes to student performance. So yeah, I pity the teachers in many ways. At the same time, I am angry at them because they have as much ability to relieve themselves of their ignorance as I do, and it's not that hard to find resources to find out that, look, student accomplishment has long stagnated in this country. It has basically not moved in 30, 40 years, yet we're spending a whole lot more than we did 30, 40 years ago. And we continue to do so. We continue to add to it.
Well, if I can compliment your organization, the special magic, if you will, the special sauce of the 1889 Institute, and as I like to call you Mythbusters, is to apply real hardcore econometrics to a situation. Now, one of the things that you've analyzed in the past is, and it seems to be a focus and an expertise of your organization, is the impact of the real-time cost of living, and as a direct function of that, the level of taxation as it impacts the actual spending power, in this case, the actual earning power of the teachers. So what was stunning is that over the past few weeks, and I was kidding in the opener, I mean, news of this burgeoning teachers crisis. Oh, and by the way, it would appear, and I just heard this driving in, so I haven't had a chance to really analyze it, the Kentucky governor was overridden in a veto today to raise, and I believe, if I heard it correctly, create a special sales tax to fund education. That's in addition to ostensibly, I'm sure, a property tax formula that's in place. But what the mantra of the teachers union in Oklahoma, as this story has gradually percolated up into the national consciousness, is how underpaid they are. But explain to us your methodology and explain to us the surprising conclusion when, as you so often skillfully do, compare that to the cost of living and the cost of government. Where do Oklahoma teachers really sit in terms of their peers?
Well, there were really two arguments that the teachers were using more than anything else for a teacher pay raise. One of them had to do with an alleged teacher shortage, and we won't get into the details there, although the 1889 Institute did debunk that. However, the other issue was exactly what you're saying, comparing Oklahoma's average teacher salary to the rest of the state and the country. And if you look at straight monetary averages of the states across the country when it comes to teacher salaries, Oklahoma ranked 48, and we ranked the lowest among the states that immediately surround us. That's true. There's just no doubt about it. However, there are cost of living indices that are calculated across the states, and one of them is calculated in Missouri. It uses private data. That's the one I tend to prefer because it's up to date, and it's consistent with other indices that have been used. And if you adjust the average teacher salaries in the states for the respective states' cost of living, you find that even before the teacher salary increase, Oklahoma's teacher salary actually ranks 31st in the nation. Now, we were still behind a few of our neighboring states, but we were ahead of a couple of them as well. Mm-hmm. So that right there gives you a more precise picture of where the states, where Oklahoma stood compared to the states. If you look at the change in salary, there's the increase in teacher salary that was passed by our legislature amounts to about $6,100 per teacher. You add that in, and Oklahoma goes from 48 to 28 without adjusting for cost of living. So we're almost at the middle right there. Once you adjust for the cost of living, Oklahoma's teacher salaries will rise to 11th in the nation, higher than that of Texas, which was the highest before the teacher salary increase. So now we're going to be the highest among the states that border on Oklahoma. And so this is a huge increase. In fact, I looked at the history of the average teacher salary in Oklahoma, and it hit its maximum around the year 2000. Actually, it hit its maximum right at the beginning of the Great Recession in 2009. Since then, as I pointed out earlier, it has fallen, but it fell by 7%. This is a 13% increase in teacher salaries. That means that we're going to go above our previous peak in all likelihood.
And let me just throw in, and this is where ignorance becomes deadly. And you're a real economist. I'm not an expert. I literally just play one on the radio. But it's my thought, intuitively, that if in fact you take a salary increase and so that you rise it above or bring it above the market rate, then, and here's the deadly irony, you've got the real possibility of inducing inflation, don't you?
Well, sure. I mean, it's certainly going to inflate what we spend per student in the state. It's certainly going to. There are a lot of teachers who are certified in this state who aren't teaching right now. Some of them will go back to teaching because it probably will represent a pay increase for them, or at least it'll make the job more attractive to them. This could induce slight shortages of labor in other areas of the state and push up wages. Yeah, it tends to be inflationary, absolutely.
Right. So you have then the specter of taxes rising, which again dilutes the power of the spending dollar earned by folks who work in the dreaded private sector, create more of a tax burden on them, and go back to what we talked a few months ago. You then essentially, through this one ill-founded move based on emotion rather than fact, you actually have the possibility of lowering the standard of living for the average Oklahoman. Is that the logical extreme of where this can go?
Well, yeah. Basically, by definition, if you're taxing more from people than you did before, then yeah, it's going to lower the standard of living. Now, people are always talking about, well, now wait a minute, what about all the economic benefit of putting more money in the hands of teachers? What about the economic benefit of education? I had someone I was debating not too long ago ask me, what's more important than education? And my reply was to him, well, I kind of like living, and given that eating is necessary to that, I think food's important. I think shelter is important. I think clothing is important. I mean, how do you deal with somebody who seems to think that to the exclusion of all else, education takes priority? And it's just ridiculous. It's sophistry to make such assertions. Yet that happens all the time. I still remember debating with a gentleman in Texas one time who objected to some economic figures about the productivity of roads, and he objected because, well, this shows that roads are more productive than education. Well, keep in mind, of course, if you're measuring real world benefits, a lot of the people who are getting educated are getting, like in higher education, getting anthropology degrees. And I just don't know how productive that really is compared to a road. And so it's hard to talk logically to people who, they're taking care of children, and that's who they put right in front of them. They hide behind children all the time. I want I want a higher salary, and it's for the children. I want better working conditions. I want fewer children in my classroom for the children. It's, at some level you have to admit it's just nonsense.
Well, and two, I just want to point out, and again, you're a real economist, and if you're just joining us, I'm talking to Byron Schlomek. He with the 1889 Institute, a leading think tank. We became acquainted with them through our connection with the Goldwater Institute. The folk continually muddy the impact of money spent in what we like to say the dreaded private sector, that is in the ostensibly what purports to be a free market, as opposed to money spent on government. I was trained that the term for government expenditure was a rent, not the rent you pay to your apartment, but economics calls it a rent. And the multiplier effect is a function, a calculation of how many times that money will essentially cycle through the economy to different hands within any given regional economy, and as a result create growth. That growth being hopefully exponential. Someone spends $10,000 getting your kitchen redone. The carpenter who does it spends $5,000 of it on a local hardware store and supply store, spends another $4,000 on his people and $1,000 to him. The $4,000 that the workers receive, they spend on food and groceries and all sorts of basic stuff, which by and large stays in the economy. Money spent on government, on the other hand, largely is capital flight. So the money spent on taxes for government services, and again, please jump in if I'm wrong here, but the money ultimately spent on government services by no means has the market efficiency, the multiplier effect, the level of growth as a function of expenditures that money spent, well, on the local hardware store or on the local carpenter. It's just simply established fact.
Well, right. It's because it's redistributionary in its impact, and so So that means if you just move money from point A to point B, or from person A to person B, they're essentially going to spend the money the same way, and that means that there's no productive impact. It's even worse because if you take money from person A who would invest and actually create new wealth, and you give it to person B who's just out to consume, you don't get anything like the economic oomph compared to what you would otherwise, especially in the long run. I'll give you a good example, and it's education related right here in Oklahoma. Oklahoma educates 75% of its year-olds in a pre-kindergarten system, while 40 states in this country educate 35% or fewer of their 4-year-olds in their public schools. We did that. Oklahoma did that several years ago. They added 4-year-olds in a fully funded pre-kindergarten system is essentially what it is. Well, what that means is we're providing daycare for free. Now, if people were paying private individuals to keep their 4-year-olds during the day, it costs you maybe what? The people taking care of the children, their salaries probably be in the $25,000 range. Here, the minimum teacher salary is $31,000. That's before the raise. It'd be $37,000 after the raise, and that means that people, basically babysitters, are get minimum $37,000 a year. That's a pure redistribution. There's no productivity involved in that,
Right.
And therefore it's a complete waste. Meanwhile, people who could be running their own businesses, taking care of children far more efficiently, without nearly the investment in facilities that aren't really accomplishing anything. And the way I know it's accomplishing nothing is that on the fourth grade national assessment of education progress, that's a testing instrument. On that fourth grade instrument, Oklahoma has remained flat, just behind the national average. With this wonderful pre-K program that we have in place, we haven't made one bit of progress in the fourth grade NAEP. So there is no productivity from this four-year-old pre-K program. It's just a pure redistribution of income.
Right.
And not just to the teachers, but also to the parents of those children, frankly, because they're not bearing the direct cost of their own children's daycare.
Wow.
So, yeah, I agree with you. You do not get the oomph out of government spending that you do in the private sector. It's impossible. The incentives just aren't there.
Right, and the option exists in the absence of a mandated, guaranteed public sector. The option exists for many people to send their children to a private, probably absolutely more cost-efficient system that can generate and be developed in the absence of a mandated government experience, which would then, of course, drive the wages back into the private sector, and it would be based on choice as opposed to a quote-unquote requirement, a mandated solution to a problem that, quite frankly, does not exist. And parents then would have a choice of spending extra money to go to a system that might be a little bit more advanced, or they would have a choice of retaining people within their families or private market solutions for daycare. Instead, again, we skim money off the top, and we're shocked, I say, when you have little in gains in terms of productivity. I got to ask you at a certain point, Byron. I mean, you know, we've had you on 4 or 5 times over the last few months, and it's great. Your analysis from your group is spot on. How do people that, you know, obviously you're preaching to a very receptive audience, people who want to learn and want to get past the myths and the smoke, quite mirror, the smoke and mirrors. Do people? How can I best phrase this? If you're old enough to have seen the original Odd Couple television show, Felix, when hearing something he did not like, would wring his hands in his ears and make loud nasal noises. You're essentially preaching when you're talking about the education industry to a group of individuals who are, by and large, highly educated, and ostensibly should have benefited from some level of some basic economics education, some fundamental exercise in civics. You know, off the record, just between us, do you think it's just a cynical ignorance, or do folks actually believe the foolishness they're peddling? It's got to be maddening for you because you know you're going out there not as a qualitative person, as a quantitative person with those dreaded facts. What's it like to have to deal in this era of ignorance?
Well, you put the nail on the head. It's just absolutely infuriating. Why do I think people are the way they are? Well, look, I will tell you right now, most of the people in the education establishment may be educated and that they have college degrees, but to a great extent they're miseducated and they've been misled about what's effective, for example. I've been looking a little bit for another paper at the history of education, and one of the issues that has never been fully resolved in education is something as fundamental as how to teach kids how to read. And the right way to teach kids how to read when you have an alphabet is to teach the sounds that letters represent,
Right.
and teach kids how to break down words in terms of sounds. That's how you teach them the rudiments of reading. Now, that's not how an advanced reader reads, but that's the rudiments of reading and how you learn new words easily without having to constantly go to somebody for, a word picture or something. And there's still arguments about this. And it's because the education establishment, the professors in colleges are philosophically predisposed to teach reading in English as if every word is a picture, sort of like the way the Chinese learn how to read. Well, this is absolutely ridiculous, and it causes dyslexia. And this has been demonstrated, not in all kinds of scientific ways. It's been demonstrated that this whole word that the educationists like to use doesn't work. And causes reading pathologies. But we're still debating it to this day. And to this day, kids are being trained improperly, which means that they're not being trained at all, really, in how to read at the rudimentary level.
My wife is a reading specialist.
Coming from?
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question. I think in the end, when we're having a debate like we were having this last 2 weeks here, it's just an us versus them mentality. We're teachers, nobody else understands us, and we're under siege, and they act that way. Very obnoxious, very rude, and there's no way. It's very, very difficult to penetrate that way of thinking.
Right. No, I was going to say, we've had folks, and one of the issues we've covered on this show is dyslexia. And my wife, full disclosure, happens to be a reading specialist. And there's a necessary transition that takes place, and I'm even less of an expert on dyslexia than I am in economics, but where people, there's a great word track that simplifies as it makes it accessible. You essentially transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And where the gap occurs is that all these other techniques that are used, as you described, to learn to read, don't translate then in an ability to, or then read to learn. And by that, I mean, as you get older, you're not really focused on reading. Reading should be reflexive. But what happens, though, is that you can't possibly, it becomes a processing issue. You can't possibly, if you learn to read incorrectly, process information at the rate you need to. And it's caused a crisis in our school systems because of we're competing globally. And I know that's an overused cliche, but I have a daughter who is a recent college graduate who went to an Ivy League university, and I have another daughter who is at an Ivy League related university. And what was fascinating for me was going to freshman orientation and understanding that these are two of the finest universities by general consensus on the planet, and that a significant, if not a majority, of the students there are foreign. And what I mean by foreign is not, for example, perhaps a Chinese family who's immigrated to the United States, or an Indian family I'm talking about students whose parents still live in Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia or in Western Europe. So what is the last vestige of what was once arguably the finest educational system in the world, we are now reduced to being a net exporter of university skills, because ultimately the people who are coming here increasingly have no intention of staying here in the long term, and we will start to see the same type of educational flight that we saw in terms of manufacturing and in terms of capital. And that's the last pillar of American excellence in practice, not in theory, but in practice, that's really left. And then what do we do?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And, the miseducation of our youth obviously is a major cause of that situation. And, I honestly do not know what level of scientific knowledge has to be brought to bear to make some of these people see the light. Mm-hmm. But honestly, they're immune. They're immune at some level. Some of these people are. And so, on the one hand, while I honor teachers and think that they're probably individually some of the least to blame for the state of our education system, I far more hold administrators and school board members and union bosses responsible for the situation we're in. They're the ones with the political power to make a change. Right. And teachers, for the most part, don't have that political power, certainly not individually. They only do corporately because they're being misled, and they fundamentally do not understand what's going on. And look, I understand why. They're busy. They have lesson plans to make out. They have kids to deal with. Right. They have long days, just like the rest of us. But at some point, I just honestly, I do not know how to reach them, because when you're trying to tell them the truth, they get their backs up and they stop listening.
No, I hear you. I mean, ultimately, the problem can be solved almost with a flick of a light switch. This isn't something that's institutionally cast in stone, if you will, although it would require a significant shift in curriculum and emphasis, how we pay for education, quite frankly, how we look at education in its totality. The first thing we have to discuss is this long-held covenant that's been theoretically in place between taxpayer and government. And the notion has always been that the covenant existed that the taxpayer would pay his or her taxes, and would it receive in response a government that was fair, a government that was skilled, and a government that was focused on a few fundamental aspects of life: policing, contract law, and by some people's admission, education. When you look at outside of isolated circumstances in just about every state across the nation, our primary educational system is crumbling. And we are at risk of leaving really an entire generation behind. And so as a result, what you've got is the potential for real long-term cultural failure here. And we're talking about fundamental workplace issues that are at stake. And so in the absence of that, what do we do? And for a lot of folks who are either A, in a position financially to do so, or B, force themselves to do it, is to abandon public education completely. Sometimes it's the simpler things. I often tell anecdotally of someone in my family who went to a non-public school. There was a teacher situation a few years back where there were some wonderful French language teachers who didn't have enough hours. I don't know exactly how it happened, but they all were of Middle Eastern descent. All of them were fluent in Arabic. all of them were quite capable teachers. So the idea came up, and I guess it was implemented within a year, that why not have an Arabic program? Why not? So all of a sudden you had this local school from freshman year in high school through senior year have a 4-year program in Arabic as one of the available languages. Within the space of 6 to 8 years, you had students from that programming going to Ivy League universities specializing in Middle East studies, as well as some of the schools like George Washington and Amherst. You had some of the top students all of a sudden literally reorient their entire careers around what frankly started as an exercise in languages. That's how swift and sudden the impact can be on that type of fundamental shift. You instantly, it's the old routine. In case of fire, break glass. In this case, it was really, I don't think anyone thought there would be that type of long-term, or immediate, I should say, response. But literally, within a handful of years, you had students who were obviously very bright to begin with. Arabic's a challenging language, but coming up with career choices that heretofore wouldn't have existed. And that's the type of responsiveness that needs to be in place in an economy. We constantly talk about the disruptor of the economy. The marketing cliche is eat your young. That is to out-innovate yourself out of a certain line of business before someone else does it for you. So we give a great deal of credit for that, particularly on those private universities that have embraced entrepreneurial studies as a discipline. Yet at its most fundamental level, our educational system, we are a complete failure at that. And sadly, I'm a cynic, and I love you seem in our dealings to be an optimist, optimistic person at heart. You're a nice person. People like you. That I don't know if anything. Well, I don't know if anything other than sheer collapse is going to be what's necessary to reorient the ship. I don't know. What are your thoughts? I mean, where do we go from here?
Well, number one, we do need to realize that our education system is socialist. It truly is.
Mm-hmm.
The definition of socialism is government ownership and control, and that is public education in this country. It wasn't always that way. Originally, when people began to tax themselves for the purpose of schooling, they were basically contracting with a private individual mm-hmm. to run a little school in a building that maybe the community owned, but in a very real sense, they said, "Go ye therefore, do good things, and if we're not pleased, we'll fire you." And for the most part, it was up to parents to do that, and so in a very real sense, it was entrepreneurial. The gentleman who founded the 1889 Institute founded something called the Edupreneur Academy, where he's trying to teach people how to go out and start their own charter schools, for example. Many states, including Oklahoma, do have charter school laws, and Oklahoma recently, not this year, but recently liberalized their laws. They originally had it set so that only school districts could issue charters. Now, there's another entity in the state that can, and it's a lot more generous with charters. In Arizona today, more than 10% of the students in that state are matriculating in schools of choice, not the monopolies government schools. Charter schools are considered public schools, but they're schools of choice. They're exempted from a lot of the silly rules, especially the employment rules like minimum salary schedules and tenure that the public schools are subject to. And one of the things that was instituted in law here in Oklahoma is something called a conversion school. Right. So a school district, a local school district, can essentially start a charter school with their district. It's not a true charter school because they still have full access to the district finances, and they don't have an independent board. But one school district, very small one here in Oklahoma, because they were having financial difficulties, contracted with a private company called Epic, a charter school company. They use the contracted with that company to run their entire school district. And so basically you have a school district that has privatized itself. And another district that did that with their K through 8 campus, because they had a bunch of teachers who were what we call emergency certified and had not been able to get fully certified. And they didn't want to fire those teachers. They were doing a good job, regardless of what the certification law says. And so they converted. That's a new thing that not a lot of states have with the flexibility that Oklahoma has established. And I think that's the way to go. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point that there are a few people who really advocate for, you've probably heard of the separation of school and state movement, where they basically want to defund education and make it completely private, and parents have to pay for the kids and charity and that sort of thing. We're never going to get there. I don't even advocate for that. I don't see that we're ever going to get there. We've pretty much agreed that we're going to have publicly funded education. What we need to argue about and have an honest argument about is whether or not we need to have a free government provided education. And that, to me, is the debate that I can win over time.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, it continues to be a challenge. It's at the root of one of our biggest economic challenges in this country, and quite frankly, the clock is ticking. There's been a significant series of educational failures here in Rhode Island, and one gentleman associated with the local chapter of the National Association of Manufacturers a few years ago, unprovoked, made the statement, and you can imagine how this went over, that a significant part of the Ute, if you will, of Rhode Island were only borderline employable. That was a bomb.
Oh, that's absolutely true. But you know what? It's not just their skills that are lacking. It's also impacting our culture. I mean, we have a situation where the millennial generation doesn't find the First Amendment and freedom of speech particularly important. Why is that? It's because of the way they've been miseducated in the government schools. Mm-hmm. And so, I started working for a state legislator in Texas back in 1994, and he always carried a school voucher bill. And one of the reasons I was so enthusiastic for that bill, sure, I want well-educated kids. I want a system that's efficient in terms of how well it does its job. But frankly, more important to me was I felt like, and I still feel like, that school choice can save the republic. Mm-hmm. I honestly believe that culturally, as well as skills-based, we have to have school choice. We have to de-socialize education, or our very civilization is at stake. And we're 20, almost 25 years later, and we still don't have that much in the way of school choice. And quite frankly, things have gotten worse culturally, as well as in terms of skills, like you said.
Right, and when you look at the recent Second Amendment debate, and unfortunately that's a barometer of it. You've got two issues at stake during this debate. The presence of a highly emotional, highly charged issue in the wake of an incredible tragedy, finding its way into the body politic, where public tragedy should never really impact long-term policy. Mirror that against the backdrop of that public policy being what some would call not just a constitutional freedom or constitutional right, but a natural right. That is the right to bear arms and the right to self-defense. As I like to say, a right so enshrined in our American legal system that, quite frankly, self-defense is a appropriate response against a charge of murder. And if we truly hold life in sanctity, and this, I'm not getting into the abortion argument or any of those things, but ultimately we as a society truly hold life as we should, yet at the same time, we would challenge the ability of the individual to defend themselves and the right to bear arms, a natural right, that it points to a complete collapse in the understanding of how a republic, a representative republic, a democracy, the difference between your civil rights, your civil liberties, and your rights granted to you simply by birth. And the notion that we've fallen so far so quickly in terms of a quote unquote liberal education, not liberal in the sense that you and I are discussing right now, but in terms of the liberal education being education filled with discussions and analysis and reason, and a education in your not just your civic or civil rights, but your civic responsibilities. And I would argue that having a complete understanding of your civil rights is a civil responsibility. Then how could we expect the current generation, who is operating near isolation from any of these issues, to have an intelligent, well-informed perspective of just what's at stake when you attempt to pass something like a red flag law, where you're willing to essentially create an extra legal process to civilly, if you will, remove a person's rights without any of the due process traditionally associated with it. And you make those incredible leaps in logical failure because you have no logical training. And a true liberal education is not the bailiwick of only the rich. Quite frankly, it's the least capital form of education imaginable. Anybody can have a liberal education. A liberal education is a series of discussions and analysis. All you need is a couple pencils and some notepaper to have a true liberal education, and some dog-eared copies of a few philosophers as you get older. Yet we fail to provide that. At least out here. Is it any better in Oklahoma? Is there any sort of no graduation requirement?
No, it's worse here. The fact is that you can look at our education attainment. You look at our university graduation rates; they're pitiful. In Texas, they graduate. I think I was looking at statistics. I think they graduate about 59% of their students within 4 years. We graduate 40 some odd percent within 4 years. No, Oklahoma is worse. And one of the bad things here is just a lack of expectation of excellence. My wife and I grew up in the same town, and it was a small school. We had an 8th grade English teacher in common, and that 8th grade English teacher taught us grammar, something that is rarely taught in public school anymore, but she taught grammar, among other things. But she said, you must make 95% on every one of my grammar tests, or you do not pass my class. She announced that at the beginning of the year, and we all believed her. And she gave you chances to retake exams so that you could attain a 95%. But the fact is, she expected you to learn that. And expectations, you know how much they cost? They don't cost anything. Mm-hmm. And every kid in 8th grade rose to the occasion, and they made their 95% because they believed that if they didn't, they weren't going to pass. Right. And she was serious about it. And indeed, she was serious about it. And that, to me, is the biggest thing lacking in public education today. We don't hold kids accountable. We don't have high expectations. We constantly make excuses for them. We do statistical analyses and justify poor performance based on race and ethnicity, which I consider to be highly racist. And yet, that's perfectly acceptable in public education today. And we make allowances for it. And we say, oh, we can't expect minorities to behave well. Therefore, we won't punish anybody. We won't hold anybody accountable for disrupting class. This is the kind of environment teachers are operating in today. Many of them philosophically pitifully enough, agree with that stuff, but a lot of them, like my wife, don't, and yet they persevere um, on a daily and yearly basis, and I have a lot of respect for that. I do, I truly do. Again, I don't consider teachers to be the worst actors in the system, except that they've been. I guess the best that I can say is that they suffer from some sort of Stockholm syndrome, and they just refuse to see the bad of the system that they're living, that they work in on a daily basis.
Well, as again, my wife is a teacher. The other thing that's missing, much to I think the teaching establishment's, I would say demise, is the absence of a free market to hire teachers. If you look across just about any profession, whether it be plumbers, engineers, accountants, there exists an entire industry of placement people and headhunters to hire away the best and the brightest to another opportunity in exchange for maybe a different, more challenging work environment. Maybe it's just money, who knows? When was the last time you ever heard of a excellent sophomore or junior high school physics teacher getting recruited away by another school?
Well, right. Look, this is all because, I mentioned this when I talked about pre-K earlier. They all get paid the same. It does not matter if you're a science teacher, an excellent science teacher, or a really lousy PE teacher. If you have the same number of years of experience in the same school district, you get paid the same. It doesn't matter if you're just babysitting 4-year-olds. If you have the same experience as that excellent science teacher, you get paid the same. It's absurd, and that is a union-imposed requirement. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the teachers believe in that. And I think part of it might be, I don't know, it might be a certain maturity level that's involved. I just think it's because it's been unionized. And school boards have come to accept this. The fact is that if you pay above a state minimum schedule, which is established here as well as in Texas, as well as in every state I know of, if you pay above that minimum, there is no obligation to pay everybody the same just based on experience. They all do.
You certainly wouldn't see that in yours or my world. It's a function of skill, combination of skill, work ethic, results. Yikes. Well,
exactly.
Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us again this week. Why don't you give folks the rundown of where they can find out more about the 1889 Institute and some of the other things you may have coming up that you might want to give us an early look at.
Sure. Well, again, it's the 1889 Institute. We're up on the web, www.1889institute.org. We are a nonprofit think tank. In the near future, we're going to be looking more and more at licensing of professions, occupational licensing.
Right.
Talking about how unnecessary it is, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. And hope to, in the very near future, publish a short paper on the history of the public education system and, quite frankly, its failures in a very succinct and compact way that I think it'll be focused on Oklahoma, but I think people across the states would be interested because, frankly, you can tell the same story for every state in this country today.
No, that's wonderful stuff. Now, any chance, I know I've asked you this in the past, but it's only a few months away, any chance 1889 will be at the Libertarian Party National Convention in New Orleans this July?
You know, I'd love to go, but I doubt that's in the cards.
Well, we'd love to see it, but also the invitation continues to be open here in Rhode Island, should you or any one of your organization find their way up there. As always, the beer/coffee/real pizza, because I'm thinking our pizza is better up here than Oklahoma, is on us. Again, thank you so very, very much for joining us. You grace us with your presence, and you continue to raise the bar. Folks, 1889institute.org. Another one of the half a dozen or so websites that we give to you for your review. Original writing, original insight, original perspective, original thought in a highly accessible format, challenging, discussing, investigating the leading issues of the day. You don't have to settle for regurgitated, misrepresented, homogenized, pasteurized, white or whites, bright or brights news that's brought to you by some third-rate news organization. Go to organizations like 1889, challenge yourself, agree, disagree, but find reasoned debate to be had on the menu at all times. Byron, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Take care.
Folks, we're going to take a very quick break right now. I think we're going to probably go into our segment, one of my favorite points of the night. We're going to take a little bit of a break with our Yacht Club sponsors. By the way, that last hour with the 1889 Institute, Byron Schwabach, that was sponsored by Beacon Shipping and Logistics. If you notice, our programming here on the Coalition is largely commercial free. We give shout outs to our sponsors throughout the evening, but what it allows us to do on an evening like tonight is to have uninterrupted, thoughtful conversation by some very, very smart people. Maybe not necessarily me, but the people who are willing to spend time with us on a Friday night, on one of the nicest nights in this spring so far, is astonishing. Byron hails to us from Oklahoma, where they continue to be thought leaders, challenging the status quo, bringing real-life numbers to place, I'll call it, the presumed arguments, the conventional wisdoms, really in danger through the harsh spotlight of analysis and numbers. Folks, we're going to take a quick break. This is the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. It is a wonderful night to come downtown, Thayer Street, the downtown shopping district, Wickenden Street, sample literally a living buffet of stores, retail, food. It's all here. We're blessed in living in one of America's great small cities. I've had the fortune of living in New York City, and New York City is a special place. Boston, Providence, world-class universities, all the benefits that come from them. Theater, art, music, politics, debate, sports. Some of the best restaurants on the planet, right here in Providence. Of course, coalitionradio.us, where this and all shows live in perpetuity by simply clicking on the YouTube link at the top of the home page. On the Mighty Mighty Twitter at coalition_radio, and of course, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio. If you could take a moment to like or follow us on any one of those social media platforms, we'd be very grateful. Folks, stay tuned. We'll be right back.